before history remembered their names, before kings feared their arrival, before their ships appeared on the shores of England, France, Ireland, and beyond. There was only the sea. Listen closely. The rhythmic splash of wooden oars breaking the cold northern water. The groan of timber as a longship rises and falls with each wave. The steady breath of men pulling together through the morning mist. This is not simply the sound of a voyage. It is the sound of a civilization that would change the course of history. For generations, we've been told we know who the Vikings were. We picture towering warriors with horned helmets, swinging axes as they storm helpless villages in search of gold. Hollywood has made them larger than life. Television has turned them into unstoppable conquerors. Even children's books have helped create an image that seems impossible to question. But what if almost everything you've been taught about the Vikings is wrong? What if the horned helmets never existed? What if the men rowing these ships spent far more time farming than fighting? What if the greatest Viking achievement wasn't conquest at all, but exploration? And what if modern archaeology and ancient DNA are revealing a Viking world far more diverse, connected, and sophisticated than historians once imagined? The truth is that the real Vikings were not simply raiders. They were master shipbuilders whose engineering allowed them to cross oceans that other Europeans feared. They were merchants who traded silver from the Islamic world, silk from Byzantium, and furs from the frozen north. They were skilled craftsmen, lawmakers, poets, navigators, settlers, and explorers whose influence stretched from the rivers of Eastern Europe to the shores of North America centuries before Columbus ever sailed west. The legends have survived for over 1,000 years, but legends have a habit of growing larger while the truth quietly waits beneath them. Today, we're peeling away those legends one by one. We'll follow the evidence left behind in ancient graves, weathered ships, forgotten settlements, runa stones, medieval chronicles, and cutting-edge genetic research. Piece by piece, they reveal a picture so different from the popular image that you may never think about Vikings the same way again. As the mist begins to lift, the coastline slowly appears on the horizon. The rowers don't know it yet, but their journey will become one of the greatest stories ever told. And before we uncover who these people really were, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from and whether you've ever visited a Viking site or museum. If you're fascinated by documentaries that separate historical myths from archaeological evidence, subscribe to Unknown Discoveries and join us on the journey. Every week, we explore the mysteries that history still hasn't fully explained. Because what these rowers are about to teach us isn't just the story of the Vikings. It's the story of how history is written, and how, sometimes, history gets it spectacularly wrong. The first surprise begins with a single word, a word almost everyone uses without ever questioning what it truly meant. That word is Viking. The longship glides forward as the morning fog begins to dissolve. The rowers keep their steady rhythm, each stroke carrying the vessel farther from the familiar coastline and deeper into history itself. It feels like the beginning of a great expedition, but before we can understand where these people went, we first need to understand who they were. Surprisingly, the greatest misunderstanding begins with the very word we use to describe them. Today, we casually call them the Vikings, as though they were a single nation united under one king with one culture and one purpose. Yet the people who lived in Scandinavia more than 1,000 years ago would never have recognized that description. In fact, the word Viking did not describe an entire people at all. Most historians believe the Old Norse term Vikinger referred to a person taking part in an overseas expedition, particularly one involving seaborne travel that could include trading, exploration, or raiding. To go on a Viking was more like undertaking a voyage than belonging to a nationality. It was something a person did, not necessarily what they were. That simple distinction changes everything. Imagine calling every modern sailor, merchant, explorer, and naval officer by exactly the same name, regardless of where they lived or what they actually did. It would erase the enormous variety that existed among them. The same mistake has been made with the Vikings. Most people living in Scandinavia during the Viking Age never sailed across the sea in search of treasure. They remained at home, tending farms, raising livestock, forging tools, weaving cloth, fishing along rugged coastlines, and building communities that had little to do with the dramatic raids that dominate popular culture. As the Longship continues its journey, the camera leaves the deck and follows a narrow path inland. Instead of battlefields, we find farms nestled between forests and fjords. Children chase one another across open fields while women prepare food from grain harvested only weeks before. Blacksmiths shape glowing iron into tools as much as weapons. Carpenters carefully fit planks together for the next generation of ships. Traders count silver coins brought from lands hundreds, even thousands of miles away. This was everyday Viking life, less glamorous than the legends perhaps, but infinitely more remarkable. Archaeology has transformed our understanding of these communities. Excavations across Norway, Denmark, and Sweden have uncovered well-built farmsteads, workshops, marketplaces, and ports that reveal societies far more organized than the stereotype of wandering raiders suggests. These were people who understood engineering, navigation, craftsmanship, commerce, and law. They built thriving settlements connected by trade networks stretching across Europe and beyond. Their success depended not only on strength, but on cooperation, innovation, and remarkable adaptability. Even personal appearance tells a different story from the familiar myths. For generations, films portrayed Vikings as wild, filthy warriors with tangled hair and unkempt beards. Yet archaeological discoveries paint a far more surprising picture. Combs carved from antler, finely crafted tweezers, ear-cleaning tools, razors, and grooming kits have been recovered from Viking sites across Scandinavia and the British Isles. Medieval observers occasionally remarked that Norsemen bathed regularly and took care of their appearance, something that even drew criticism from rivals who believed their cleanliness made them unusually attractive. Then there is perhaps the most famous Viking image of all, the horned helmet. It appears on everything from sports logos to Halloween costumes, yet no authentic Viking battle helmet with horns has ever been discovered. The idea gained popularity in the 19th century when costume designers creating productions inspired by Norse mythology added dramatic horns to make performers appear more imposing. The image was so striking that it eventually became inseparable from the Viking legend, despite having virtually no basis in the archaeological record. In reality, the few surviving Viking helmets are practical, compact, and designed for protection rather than spectacle. For warriors facing real combat, enormous horns would have been more of a liability than an advantage, making helmets heavier and easier for an opponent to grab. It's a perfect example of how one artistic decision, made centuries after the Viking Age had ended, reshaped the public imagination more effectively than the historical evidence ever could. As the Longship emerges from a narrow fjord into the open sea, the waves grow larger and the horizon stretches endlessly ahead. Looking at these vessels, another question naturally arises. If the Vikings were not primarily conquerors or pirates, how did relatively small communities from the edge of northern Europe travel farther than almost anyone else of their time? The answer wasn't found in their weapons. It was found in the ships themselves. The rhythm of the oars quickens as the Longship leaves the shelter of the fjord and enters the open sea. Around the crew, there is nothing but water stretching toward every horizon. No landmarks, no towering mountains to guide them, no compass pointing north. Only the endless Atlantic and the confidence of sailors who understood the sea better than almost anyone on Earth. Looking at these ships today, it is easy to admire their beauty. But to the people who encountered them over 1,000 years ago, they represented something far more extraordinary. They represented the impossible. The greatest Viking weapon was never the sword or the axe. It was the ship. At first glance, a Viking longship appears deceptively simple. Built almost entirely from oak, its overlapping planks formed a lightweight yet incredibly strong hull that could flex with powerful waves instead of breaking against them. This method of construction, known as clinker building, allowed the vessel to survive conditions that would have overwhelmed many other ships of the period. Every curve, every plank, and every rivet reflected generations of accumulated knowledge passed from master shipbuilders to apprentices. These were not crude boats assembled by chance. They were masterpieces of engineering. Their shallow draft made them unlike almost any other vessel of their age. A longship could cross rough seas one week and glide silently up narrow rivers the next. It could land directly on a beach, unload its crew in moments, and depart before defenders had time to organize. The same design that enabled lightning-fast raids also opened trade routes deep into the heart of Europe, connecting distant cultures in ways that reshaped the medieval world. As the crew rows onward, a favorable wind begins to fill the square woolen sail. One by one, the oars are lifted. From the water, the sound changes. The rhythmic splashing gives way to the gentle creak of timber and the snap of canvas as the ship surges forward under the power of the wind alone. It is a reminder that these voyages depended not only on physical strength, but on an intimate understanding of weather, currents, tides, and stars. Viking navigators crossed vast distances without magnetic compasses, relying instead on generations of experience, careful observation, and an extraordinary ability to read the natural world. They watched the position of the sun, memorized coastlines, studied migrating birds, observed whales, and learned how the color of the sea and the movement of clouds could reveal the presence of land long before it appeared on the horizon. For centuries, historians wondered how these sailors consistently found their way across the North Atlantic. Modern research has even explored the possibility that under certain conditions, they may have used naturally occurring crystals, sometimes called sunstones, to estimate the position of the hidden sun when clouds obscured the sky. Whether such stones were widely used remains debated, but the discussion itself highlights a larger truth. Viking navigation was far more sophisticated than people once imagined. Their success was not built on luck. It was built on knowledge. The farther their ships traveled, the larger their world became. To the west, they reached the islands of the North Atlantic, settling the Faroe Islands in Iceland before eventually sailing to Greenland. Archaeological evidence shows that Norse explorers even established a settlement at Lenzo Meadows in what is now Newfoundland, making them the first known Europeans to reach North America centuries before Christopher Columbus. To the east, other Scandinavian voyagers followed rivers through present-day Russia and Ukraine, creating trade routes that linked northern Europe with the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic world. They arrived in Constantinople, where some joined the elite Varangian Guard, sworn to protect the Byzantine emperors. Others reached bustling markets connected to Baghdad, returning home with silver coins. Luxurious textiles, spices, glassware, and ideas gathered from civilizations thousands of miles away. This was no isolated society living at the edge of the known world. The Viking Age was an age of astonishing connectivity. Scandinavian merchants exchanged goods with cultures speaking different languages, following different religions, and living under entirely different political systems. Archaeologists have uncovered Arabic, silver coins in Sweden, Byzantine artifacts in Norway, and Scandinavian objects scattered across Eastern Europe, demonstrating that Viking networks stretched farther than many people realize. These discoveries challenge the old image of Vikings as people interested only in plunder. Trade often proved more profitable than warfare, and many voyages that began with commerce ended without a single sword being drawn. Yet history remembers the raids far more vividly than the markets. There is a reason for that. Violent events are recorded more readily than peaceful exchanges, and terrified chroniclers naturally wrote about the attacks that devastated their communities rather than the ordinary days when merchants quietly conducted business. The result is a historical record that emphasizes fear while often overlooking the centuries of trade, diplomacy, settlement, and cultural exchange that unfolded alongside it. As the sun begins to sink lower over the horizon, the crew sees another coastline emerging in the distance. For some, it promises opportunity. For others, it will become a day remembered in terror for generations. But were the Vikings truly the uniquely savage warriors history often portrays? Or has even that reputation been shaped by who survived to write the story? That question takes us to one of the most enduring and most misunderstood chapters of the Viking Age. The Longship slows as it approaches an unfamiliar coastline. The crew watches silently from the deck while waves break against the shore. Somewhere beyond the trees, smoke rises into the morning sky. It could be a thriving trading settlement. It could be a monastery. It could be a village that has never before seen strangers arrive from the sea. The men aboard do not yet know what awaits them, and neither do the people on land. History often freezes moments like this into a single image, a terrifying Viking raid, but reality was rarely so simple. If you ask almost anyone today what Vikings were known for, the answer usually comes without hesitation. They raided. They burned villages. They stole treasure. And yes, there is truth in that. Viking raids were real, sometimes devastatingly so. The attack on the monastery of Lindisfarne in northeastern England in AD 793 shocked Christian Europe. Monasteries, often lightly defended yet rich in precious objects made of gold and silver, became attractive targets. Medieval writers described scenes of panic and destruction, portraying the attackers as punishment sent by God. Those accounts became some of the most influential records of the Viking Age, shaping how generations would remember the Norse. But we must ask an important question. Who wrote those stories? Almost every detailed written account of Viking raids comes from the people who suffered them. Monks recorded attacks on monasteries because they lived through them. Clerics described burned churches because those churches belonged to their communities. Their testimonies are invaluable historical sources, but like all eyewitness accounts, they reflect a particular perspective. We possess far fewer written records from the Vikings themselves. Their history survives largely through archaeology, later sagas, inscriptions carved into stone, and the objects they left behind. As a result, the Viking Age has often been viewed through the eyes of its victims rather than through the broader reality of Scandinavian society. This doesn't excuse the violence. Innocent people died. Communities were destroyed. Families were torn apart. The raids were brutal, and they deserve to be remembered honestly. But they were only one part of a much larger story. The same longships that carried warriors also carried merchants loaded with furs, walrus ivory, timber, iron, amber, and finely crafted goods. The same harbors that launched raids also welcomed traders from distant lands. Archaeological excavations at places such as Hedeby in present-day Germany, Birka in Sweden, Koppang in Norway, and Dublin in Ireland reveal bustling commercial centers where people from many cultures exchanged goods, languages, technologies, and ideas. These settlements were among the most dynamic trading hubs in early medieval Europe, linking Scandinavia with markets that stretched from the North Atlantic to the Black Sea. As our longship rounds the coastline, the scene changes. Instead of warriors charging ashore, merchants begin unloading barrels, animal skins, woven cloth, and carefully crafted tools. Local traders approach cautiously. Different languages fill the air. Silver is weighed on finely balanced scales. Agreements are made with handshakes rather than swords. It is a scene that rarely appears in films, yet it happened countless times throughout the Viking Age. Peaceful commerce sustained Scandinavian communities far longer than warfare ever could. Trade also brought knowledge. Viking sailors encountered unfamiliar religions, new methods of construction, advanced craftsmanship, and distant political systems. Every successful voyage expanded not only their wealth, but also their understanding of the wider world. Far from existing in isolation, they became active participants in an increasingly interconnected medieval economy. Perhaps the greatest misconception is that Vikings attacked simply because they enjoyed violence. Human history is rarely that straightforward. Population growth, political rivalries, opportunities for wealth, limited farmland in some regions, and the weakness of poorly defended coastal settlements all contributed to the expansion of Viking activity overseas. These motivations were complex and varied from one expedition to another. Some voyages sought riches through trade, others through settlement, and others through raiding. Often, the same crew might engage in all three, depending on the circumstances they encountered. As the ship departs the harbor, now carrying silver alongside stories gathered from distant lands, another question emerges. If Viking ships reached so many different places, who exactly were the people aboard them? Were they all Scandinavian by birth? Or is modern science revealing something even more surprising about the Viking world? In recent years, archaeologists and geneticists have begun uncovering evidence that is transforming our understanding of Viking identity itself, and the results challenge yet another assumption that many of us have carried for decades. If you're enjoying this journey into the real Viking world, consider subscribing to Unknown Discoveries. Every documentary is built on the latest archaeological discoveries, historical research, and scientific evidence, separating enduring myths from what the evidence actually tells us. Because the next discovery may completely change how you see the past, and we're about to explore one of the biggest discoveries of all, the DNA hidden within the Viking Age itself. The sea is calm again. The Longship drifts beneath a sky filled with stars that guided countless voyages across the North Atlantic more than 1,000 years ago. The rowers rest as the sail catches a steady wind, carrying them toward another distant shore. For centuries, historians believed they already knew who these travelers were. They were Scandinavians from Norway, Denmark, and Sweden who expanded across Europe before eventually fading into history. It was a convincing story until science began examining something no medieval chronicler could have imagined: their DNA. In the last 2 decades, ancient DNA has revolutionized archaeology. Instead of relying solely on chronicles, artifacts, and sagas, researchers can now recover genetic material from Viking Age burials and compare it with populations across Europe and beyond. Every new discovery adds another piece to a puzzle that has remained incomplete for centuries. What emerged from these studies was not the simple, isolated Viking population many had expected. It was something far more dynamic. The Viking world was astonishingly interconnected. Genetic studies suggest that many people involved in Viking society had ancestry from different parts of Europe, while Scandinavian voyagers themselves mixed with communities wherever they settled. This wasn't unusual. Trade, migration, alliances, marriage, and settlement had always brought people together. The Viking Age accelerated those connections on a remarkable scale. Imagine our longship arriving at a busy trading port. Not everyone waiting on the dock speaks Old Norse. Some speak Old English. Others use Slavic languages. Traders from the Frankish kingdoms bargain over cloth and wine. Visitors from the Baltic exchange amber and furs. Travelers connected to the Byzantine world carry silks and coins stamped with emperors thousands of miles away. Languages overlap, customs blend. Children grow up with parents from different cultures. This was not a world divided by neat modern borders. It was a network of constantly moving people, goods, and ideas. The evidence is visible not only in DNA, but also in the archaeological record. Burials contain objects crafted far from Scandinavia. Arabic silver coins have been discovered in large numbers across Sweden. Byzantine jewelry appears in Norse settlements. Scandinavian-style artifacts have been unearthed across Britain, Ireland, Iceland, Greenland, Eastern Europe, and beyond. Together, they reveal that the Viking Age connected regions that many medieval Europeans would never personally see. Perhaps the greatest surprise is that there was never a single Viking look. Popular culture often imagines tall, fair-haired warriors with blue eyes, but reality was considerably more varied. Ancient DNA and historical evidence indicate that Viking communities included people with a range of physical characteristics, reflecting centuries of movement and interaction across Northern Europe. Just as today, appearance did not define identity. Shared language, culture, loyalty, and participation in society often mattered far more than ancestry alone. This changing picture also reminds us to be cautious. DNA is a powerful scientific tool, but it does not tell us everything. Genetics can reveal patterns of ancestry and movement, yet it cannot fully explain how people saw themselves, what languages they spoke, or what traditions they followed. Archaeology, history, linguistics, and genetics each provide part of the story. Only when combined do they begin to reveal the extraordinary complexity of the Viking world. As dawn breaks, our longship approaches another shoreline. This one lies farther west than almost anyone in medieval Europe believed possible. The waves crash against unfamiliar rocks. Dense forests stretch beyond the coast. The sailors scan the horizon, unaware that they are about to become the first known Europeans to reach a continent that many centuries later would transform world history. For generations, children have learned that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. Yet nearly 500 years earlier, Norse explorers had already crossed the North Atlantic, establishing a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in what is now Newfoundland. Archaeological excavations have uncovered the unmistakable remains of Norse buildings, ironworking, and artifacts, confirming what the Icelandic sagas had long suggested. Their time there appears to have been relatively brief, and they did not establish a lasting colony, but the achievement remains extraordinary. Without modern navigation, without detailed maps, and facing one of the world's most unforgiving oceans, they reached North America centuries before the better-known voyages of the Age of Exploration. As the crew steps onto this unfamiliar shore, history seems to pause. They cannot know that people will debate their journeys 1,000 years later. They cannot imagine archaeologists carefully uncovering traces of their settlement or scientists analyzing fragments of their world. They only know that they have reached another horizon. But if the Vikings could cross oceans that seemed impossible, if they traded with civilizations thousands of miles away, if their influence reached from North America to the Middle East, then one final question remains. What happened to them? Why did a civilization that once seemed unstoppable gradually disappear from history? The answer is perhaps the greatest surprise of all. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It wasn't a single battle. And it wasn't the end of the Vikings. It was their transformation. The wind begins to fade as the longship glides across calm water. The rhythm of the oars slows until, one by one, they are lifted from the sea. Ahead, a new coastline emerges, not one waiting to be conquered, but one already becoming home. Children run along the shore. Churches stand where pagan temples once dominated the landscape. Small kingdoms are growing into larger nations. The Viking Age is drawing to a close, though almost no one living through it would have recognized that they were witnessing the end of an era. Contrary to popular imagination, the Vikings did not vanish overnight. There was no single battle that erased them from history. No empire rose to destroy every Scandinavian kingdom. Instead, the transformation happened gradually, over generations. Kings consolidated their power, replacing independent chieftains with centralized rule. Christianity spread throughout Scandinavia, bringing new beliefs, institutions, and alliances that reshaped society. Trade became more valuable than raiding, and permanent settlements offered greater prosperity than seasonal expeditions across dangerous seas. The world that had created the Viking Age slowly evolved into something different. The descendants of those who had once crossed oceans in sleek wooden longships became farmers, craftsmen, merchants, priests, sailors, and citizens of emerging medieval kingdoms. Their children spoke evolving languages that would influence English and other European tongues. Their legal traditions helped shape local systems of governance. Their shipbuilding techniques inspired generations of mariners. Their settlements grew into important towns and cities, while the routes they pioneered remained vital arteries of commerce long after the last great Viking expeditions had ended. Yet their legacy never truly disappeared. Look closely at a map of Europe today, and you'll still find the marks they left behind. In England, hundreds of place names preserve Old Norse words spoken over 1,000 years ago. Across Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man, archaeology continues to uncover evidence of Norse communities that became part of the fabric of local history. Iceland still preserves one of the world's richest collections of medieval literature through the Pudapinvendavan Icelandic sagas. In Normandy, descendants of Scandinavian settlers eventually gave rise to a dynasty that would reshape England after 1066. Across the North Atlantic, traces of Viking exploration remain preserved in the landscapes they once navigated. Perhaps the greatest lesson the Vikings leave us is not about warfare at all. It is about curiosity. These were people willing to sail into seas that others feared, guided only by experience, courage, and an extraordinary understanding of the natural world. They crossed oceans without modern charts. They connected civilizations separated by thousands of miles. They adapted to unfamiliar cultures, traded across continents, and built communities in some of the harshest environments on Earth. Their story is not merely one of conquest. It is a story of exploration, resilience, innovation, and an unrelenting desire to discover what lay beyond the horizon. As our longship completes its symbolic journey, the camera slowly rises above the vessel. The rowers become smaller against the vastness of the sea. The ship that once seemed so powerful is now only a tiny silhouette moving across an endless ocean. Then, gradually, the image begins to change. The ancient vessel fades into modern coastlines. Busy ports replace quiet fjords. Passenger ferries cross waters once sailed by longships. Airliners trace invisible routes through skies that Viking navigators could scarcely have imagined. The world has changed beyond recognition, yet the spirit of exploration remains remarkably familiar. History remembers the raids because they were dramatic. But archaeology remembers the settlements. Science remembers the DNA. The sea remembers the journeys. And together they reveal a truth that is far richer than the legends. The Vikings were never simply bloodthirsty barbarians. They were explorers before they were conquerors, merchants before they were raiders, engineers before they were warriors, navigators before they were legends. The image passed down through popular culture tells only a fraction of their story. The evidence left beneath the soil, preserved in ancient ships, written in forgotten runestones, and hidden within the DNA of people who lived more than 1,000 years ago, paints a far more remarkable picture. The real Vikings were not who we imagined. They were, in many ways, even more extraordinary. If this documentary changed the way you think about the Viking Age, let us know in the comments which discovery surprised you the most. Was it the truth about the word Viking, the engineering of the longships, the journeys to North America, or the revelations from modern DNA? If you enjoy evidence-based documentaries that challenge popular myths and uncover the real stories hidden beneath history, subscribe to Unknown Discoveries and join us on our next expedition into the past. Because history is rarely as simple as the legends we inherit, and sometimes the greatest discoveries are the ones that force us to rethink everything we thought we knew. The sea grows quiet, the last ripple fades, but the journey continues.